So I participated briefly in a Reddit thread on the consciousness subreddit. Someone started this article called Neutral Monism General Discussion, and they said there's not much discussion of this, but rather than explain why I, the poster, am a neutral monist, I'd like to ask people what their own views are about neutral monism as an open question. Now, what's really notable for me, he then says some definitions: materialism, physicalism, reality is made of matter, whatever physics says, idealism, reality is made of consciousness. Note that. Reality is made of consciousness. Dualism, reality is made of both consciousness and matter. Neutral monism, reality is made of just one sort of stuff. It is unified, but the basic stuff is neither mental nor physical. And then he goes, this stuff is God or process or pure experience, events, information, or the implicate order. So I chimed in, and I tried to express why neutral monism. I thought the spirit of neutral monism, like especially as in James, right? William James, he mentions William James, in the idea that experience is the stuff, but James himself is explicit that it's actually not. It's not good to actually think of reality as made out of a kind of stuff. Neutral monism is a kind of the top rung of a ladder to be thrown away. I suggest that neutral monism points to pluralism, really, because all of this is still ingredient ontology until you get to pluralism. So there are some very smart people on the thread, even though I don't agree with any of them exactly, but like people who have read some stuff and who have put some serious thought, people who are writing books. But I haven't seen anyone on this thread challenge the ingredient ontology assumption, right? And to me, as a kind of positivist, logical positivist, it seems to me that they're doing a kind of para-science or pseudoscience, or in that as if philosophical theses are trying to mirror a substrate reality. So, I've been thinking about this whole positivistic framework, right? You have theology, then you have the next phase, which is metaphysics, and then the final phase is science or positivism. Now, in my opinion, Rorty is a very great entry into the spirit of positivism, not like not the way that he would sell himself, right? But I think the big leap from metaphysics into positivism or scientific philosophy is the shattering of the mirror, right? In this mirror is the idea that language, that metaphysical language mirrors some sort of hidden reality. So like in the discussion here under this thread, you had people saying, well, give me evidence for neutral monism. What, empirical evidence for a philosophical thesis? But that would almost suggest that this philosophical thesis is really a physical thesis, right? So to me, things start to lean towards pseudo-physics, right? And, metaphysics has always sort of smelled like superphysics or theophysics, right? It is a transitional phase, I think, between, religion, theology, and what comes later, which is already in Mach and in James, in the pragmatists at their most wild and flexible. So my interaction, I stopped in just for a moment. In my view, I said the best neutral monism is really a pluralism. I follow William James here. Consciousness is not a stuff, but just the presence or quality of every kind of stuff. Our categorization of events and entities is merely practical and not ontologically deep. On the other hand, the structure, in quotes, of physical objects, in quotes, is very different in this approach. The world can be viewed as a system of phenomenal streams or temporal contextures that are constituted by aspects or moments of shared life world objects. And he responded, the OP, that's too close to idealism for me. Now, I can see how this would strike people as idealism if they are already talking about consciousness as a kind of stuff, right? So I've bumped into neutral monists and I thought, oh wow, another neutral monist. And then they turn out to be something sort of very different from, so I abandoned the term, right? You might say because other people were getting from Mach, or mostly James, something very different than I got from them. So when I was first talking to Ryan, I hope he pops back up. If you listen to this, Ryan, I hope you say hi. I think we first started talking because we were talking about neutral monism. I think Russell was a big influence for you. And I'm not sure what your last view was, but I remember thinking that you were a kind of maybe a dual aspect. I don't know, but again, that was maybe the first and strongest example of where I thought, oh, okay, we're on the same page. And it turned out that, my view, my understanding of what I used to call neutral monism it sounded like idealism. It sounded like, Berkeley's system to people. Now, you might say that it's conceptually, genetically related, right? It definitely emerges, I think, to some degree from the immaterialist critique, from the rebellion against, John Locke's division of qualities into primary and secondary. To me, yes, Berkeley, his motives were totally reactionary, but his critique was good. He did see that there was something wrong with John Locke and what is basically the dualist position. There was another guy I used to talk to on YouTube, and I would try to defend what I was doing as a kind of updated logical positivism, a neo-logical positivism, and he found it hard to believe that what I was doing wasn't just metaphysics. And of course, under some definitions of metaphysics, sure, right? If ontology, you can say is metaphysics. But when we're all these particular human beings trying to find the best words we can to be understood, right? So every label is a sort of reduction. I mean, it's hard to make sense of other people. But why would I say that what I'm doing is not metaphysics, right? Because it's not a kind of pseudo-physics or superphysics or quasi-physics. It's an attempt to explicate what you might call the given. It's an attempt to explicate what we sort of already live in and take for granted. And then, what I get from phenomenology is that language can foreground, point people to phenomena that are there in the background, right? But language, the right words, can help somebody notice something that is then seen to have been there all along. So, for me, this is not about like some weird speculative thesis, right? It's an attempt to pin down what we already mean by consciousness. Now, consciousness is a complicated, sign or concept. So you might say that it has several shades of meaning. But I think the most important shade of meaning is what I've tried to call ontological consciousness, to really draw out that most important, thread. And then I would maybe talk about operational consciousness as another common, component or aspect of that concept or sign. So, to me, this is all in retrospect, right? I used to talk and like an ingredient ontologist like everybody else. But when people talk about consciousness as a stuff, and then, physical objects as another kind of stuff, to me, they're betraying what you might call ordinary experience. For me to be conscious is for physical objects to be present in their sensory quality. So the idea that you have this consciousness stuff and this physical stuff, it seems basically confused to me. For an organism to be conscious is for so-called physical objects to be present to or for that organism. But this is tangled. What is the status of the subject, right? And I think there's another common conflation or confusion. So, I've again tried to use two different terms to sort of separate components of the subject. So what you might call pure consciousness, which is, has been called witness consciousness. I've called it the ontological subject or the ontological ego. It's kind of like the transcendental ego, but what's wrong here, or what's so difficult here, is it's not really a thing at all, right? I think Sartre was trying to say this in The Transcendence of the Ego. Pure consciousness is just the being, presence, or quality of the shared world. But that presence, it's the presence of an aspect, the table seen from this side of the room, or the feeling in that organism's belly of hunger or satisfaction, or the sound of a bell, or the beauty, the emotion that comes with music, perhaps. So to put it crudely, you might say that so-called physical objects are basically meaningless and empty if you drain them of their quality, of their presence, right? So this is one of the problems that happens when you try to treat consciousness and matter, right, the physical, as two different kinds of stuff. Now, I think that physical works as a pragmatic categorization, of some things in the shared world, right? We don't usually call the toothache physical. We might look for physical causes of the toothache so that we can treat the toothache. Now, I think, one of the things that tempts people to project some substrate or hidden reality is the deep presupposition of the mere metaphor. And the mere metaphor is manifested as understanding truth with a capital T as the correspondence of the meanings of propositions with some sort of true or objective reality. So I think this true reality, this objective reality, it's a sort of inflation of seeing as believing, and our tendency to share beliefs about mundane objects that are classified as physical, right? So in ordinary life, people can make some claim. There's milk in the fridge. You can go to the fridge, open it up, and say, yeah, that's true. These sounds you made somehow, pre-presented a situation, and then I, verified, in quotes, I verified your claim. So this ordinary ability to sort of somehow use sounds and noises to modify the beliefs of others in a way that they typically find useful, right? I mean, if you lie, people will resent that for good reason, but generally language is used in some sort of impressively cooperative way to pre-present or represent either future possible experiences or past actual experiences. There's some topical culture war stuff that maybe obscures this issue, right? Empiricism, it refers to perception, right? An empirical claim is something that, in simple empirical claims, I can, check for myself, right? You told me there was milk in the fridge. I'm going to go down in there and look, right? But what sort of happens as science gets more complicated, these very impressive postulated entities, these very mathematical models, these marks and noises that get used in this regular, technically powerful way, they seem to point at a substrate reality, a true reality. So you might say that the pragmatic effectiveness of some of our talk, and maybe some of our own theological bias, right? Maybe, metaphysics, right? If the scientific image is understood in terms of metaphysics, this would be that intermediate stage between theology and positivism, where there's still something like truth with a capital T, or objective reality with a capital O and a capital R. The mere metaphor. This is where theology survives in metaphysics. If you have the mere metaphor and you don't question it, then you're already committed to some form of dualism. And yet, in the OP of this thread that I was reacting to, later he indicates that he believes in some sort of informational substrate, right? So, I've called this a little pejoratively elsewhere information mysticism, but more politely, it's information metaphysics, right? So it would be a kind of quasi-physical thesis. And then people might ask, well, what's the empirical evidence for this quasi-physical thesis? Now, from a positivistic point of view, or a neo-positivistic point of view, we might instead ask, what are the advantages of this explication? What kind of cognitive dissonance does this reduce? In the context of what I'm calling positivism here, which I've also called the post-truth ontology, beliefs are not presented as mirroring a true hidden reality, right? This is not some sort of metaphysics, superphysics, or quasi-physics. It's an attempt to make sense of what one takes to be ordinary shared experience, right? It's like you're trying to explicate or get a better conceptual grip on the big picture of existence. So I talked in some of my earlier videos about turning the subject inside out like an old sock, and what I meant there was what you might call the transcendental ego, or pure consciousness. It's not a thing, it's empty. It's just the presence, or the quality, or the being of the shared world, but from the perspective of the conscious organism. So in this framework, I'm trying to use the word consciousness for something that is not inside and not a stuff, but the quality, the presence, or the being of stuff, right? So this is sort of built on what you might call a recognition of the ontological difference. Now, I do think this ties into Heidegger. I think that, at least in a certain phase of his work, he's best read as some kind of phenomenalist, at least as I understand phenomenalism, right? Many people, I think, because they think consciousness is an internal stuff, they think, again, phenomenalism is just, Berkeley's system. But to me, that's a serious misunderstanding. Ernst Mach, his book, The Analysis of Sensations, that is a very powerful entry, I think, into, this kind of thinking, right? And then Ernst Mach, he also had a very positivistic spirit in the sense of post-metaphysical. He was beyond the appearance reality distinction, but a very practical, realistic, scientific person, right? And you might say that positivism, in this sense, it might not be that popular because it does not scratch the theological itch that remains in metaphysics. Now, I think it's worth noting that some of the people that called themselves logical positivists, many of them came across as scientistic. So I think that scientism, for me, it would be a metaphysical attitude, right? And they didn't want to, the fact-value distinction. There are certain prejudices that I think need to be scrubbed from logical positivism, need to be fixed, right? Like logical positivism wasn't positivistic enough. And I think in Richard Rorty's best moments, you see, he wouldn't call it this, right? But you see where logical positivism should have went in terms of its attitude. Now, I think people like Richard Rorty were sort of misunderstood by secular thinkers. He was too secular for them, right? If someone is too secular, they are misread as an irrationalist, right? Because if you challenge the mirror metaphor, if you demystify truth with a capital T, there was a certain conception of objectivity, right? What I would call the sober conception of objectivity is the absence of relevant bias, right? So, all human beings, they have a particular set of beliefs that is evolving, right? Should they be on a jury, right? You're not going to remove bias because any organism that's learned anything, in some sense that learning is a bias. And if you have a jury of 12, you're sort of taking a random sample, but what you want to exclude is a kind of, intense, significant, relevant bias. So the concept of objective reality, it's a bit like God's point of view, right? And this is, I think, the secret, theological residue in what I therefore call scientism. Not because it offends the theological point of view, but because it continues it, because it merely transforms it, because it replaces one monotheistic attitude with another. And to me, this helps explain why some people will call neutral monism what always turns out to be, from my point of view, another dualism that makes consciousness or experience into a stuff, right? Contrasted with another kind of stuff. There's always a hidden singular true reality. And then philosophy as metaphysics is conceived as an attempt to mirror with words somehow this true reality. And then theses about this so-called true reality, they have a kind of pseudo-physical status, right? They're like conjectures, right? But the true reality is sort of assumed to exist. This concept is assumed to be meaningful from the beginning. Truth itself is assumed to be meaningful from the beginning. And if you try to explain how truth might be demystified, you will probably sound like an irrationalist. You might be associated with Pomo cartoons, but no one is saying that all beliefs are equal. I don't believe anyone sincerely believes that all beliefs are equal. No radical change in personal behavior or public policy is implied. It's just an attempt to explicate existence and how science fits in with the rest of our world in a way that results in a reduction of cognitive dissonance, right? It's an attempt to tighten the big picture story that we use to make sense of our situation. So you might say that a good story might be more economical than rival stories. And that is my view. That's why I bother to share what I've found in my influences, because it's the best story that I've heard, and I try to tweak it, synthesize, or add to it.